This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen.
And this week is our last installment on our three-part series about Charles Manson and the Manson family. In part one, we focused on Manson from birth to the creation of the Manson family, and we talked about significant Manson family members. In part two, we actually focused on the crimes that made Manson infamous, and we also spoke about the living arrangements in the Manson family. So what we're going to focus on this week is the aftermath. What happened immediately after the crimes and the trial portion of the Manson case. And we're going to look at some interesting or not so well-known facts around some of the people and places involved. And we'll start with Susan Atkins. In October of 1969, Susan Atkins had been arrested in connection to the murder of Gary Hinman. She began to brag to other prisoners about the murders at the Tate and LaBianca homes. And Virginia Graham was one of those prisoners. Atkins told Graham that she was the one who stabbed Sharon Tate, and she told Graham that she had blood on her hands and it was beautiful, warm, and sticky. She told Graham that she put her hand to her mouth and tasted the blood. And then she told her that she used the blood to write pig on the front door. She went on to say that she wanted to cut the baby out of Sharon Tate, but didn't have time. When Tate begged for her baby's life, Atkins told her, "Look, bitch, I have no mercy for you. You're going to die and you better get used to it." She said that she wanted to take their eyes out and squash them against the wall and also cut their fingers off. She was going into graphic detail about these crimes. She told Graham that they had a list of other Hollywood stars that were to be mutilated and killed, including Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, and Tom Jones. Now, she said they were killing celebrities because the celebrity murders would shock the world and make people take notice. And what does Virginia Graham do? She does what everyone in jail who has something marketable does. She turns it over to the police and agrees to become a state's witness. The police in turn talk to Susan Atkins, who also agrees to become a state's witness, and both testify before the grand jury. Atkins' story to the grand jury had some statements that we would probably call self-serving. Remember, she's trying to diminish her role in the crime. Obviously, that's a common tactic we see even in offenders who eventually testify for the state. She blamed the stabbings on Tex Watson and said that he was the one who stabbed Sharon Tate. She talked of how the girls had love for Charlie and how there were no limits to what they would do for him. When the family needed things, Charlie told the girls it was up to them, and so they did whatever needed to be done. She said they would dig through dumpsters, panhandle, steal credit cards. Charlie told them they didn't have to do anything they didn't want to do, but whenever he asked, she said she felt like she had to. Atkins said that he was the only man who was a complete man. And although I'm not sure exactly what that means, she elaborated by saying that he would not take any back talk from a woman. When asked if Manson was evil, she said he was as good as he was evil and as evil as he was good. And she also said that Charlie had referred to himself as Satan and the devil. She said that on the night of August 8, Manson told her to get a change of clothes and make sure she was wearing dark clothing. She claims that she did not know where they were going, but was told by Manson to do exactly what Tex Watson said. She said that Tex talked on the way to Cielo Drive and said they were going to the house on the hill that used to belong to Terry Melcher because Tex knew the outline of the house. They were in a four-door yellow and white Ford, which was an older car with the back seat removed. Manson is the one who provided the car for the night. There was rope and bolt cutters in the car, and Tex told them that once they were in the home to take all the money that was in the home and kill whoever was there. It didn't make any difference who those people were. In the home, Jay Sebring was the first to die and Sharon Tate was the last to die. She said that Tex hit Frykowski over the head and broke the handle of the gun. Susan Atkins lost her knife somewhere between the parked car and the home on Cielo Drive. She said she took a towel to dip into Sharon Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door and then tossed it into the home, but didn't see where it landed. This is the towel that was placed over Jay Sebring's head and is another example of a self-serving statement. She said that she just kind of tossed it aside when in reality she probably placed it over Sebring's head. She said when she went back to dip the towel in Tate's blood, she noticed Tate had more injuries than she had before when Tex had stabbed her in the heart once. We know from the autopsy that Tate had been stabbed a total of 16 times. Atkins claims she didn't do any of these and didn't see how she got 15 stab wounds. Again, a self-serving statement. Atkins said she heard gurgling sounds coming from Tate, and she knew that Tate had a living being inside of her, meaning the baby, and she wanted to, but didn't have the courage to cut the baby out. When she was asked if she really meant actually cut the baby out, she said that's right. Atkins claimed they changed clothes inside the car and they gave their bloody clothes, the knives, and the gun to Kasabian, and she threw the items out of the car and over the side of hills at different intervals. Kasabian got out of the car to do this 2 of those times. Atkins said they went to another home where they thought no one was home and began using their water hose to rinse off. A man and a woman came outside and the woman started yelling that her husband was a Los Angeles police officer or deputy. Tex said sorry, he didn't think they were home and he only wanted a drink of water because they had been walking. The man asked if it was their car that he saw, and Tex said no, but the man didn't believe him and told them that they better get in the car and leave. The woman started yelling at her husband to get the tag number, and the man reached in the car to get the keys, but the car was already running, so Tex just kind of punched the gas and sped away. When they got back to the ranch, Tex told Manson what they had done and said, boy, it sure was helter-skelter. The next night, Atkins was again told to get a change of clothes, and this time Manson went with them, and he drove. They had looked at some other houses, but Manson didn't feel that those were the right ones. He saw pictures of children in one of the homes, and he did not want to kill any kids. That is when they arrived at the La Bianca home. Atkins knew this area because Manson, Atkins, and 14 others had been to a party next door to the La Bianca home the year before where they all took an LSD trip together. She said Manson went into the home alone and he had tied up the victims. He told them to paint a picture more gruesome than anybody had ever seen. The plan was to have 2 groups, 1 man and 2 girls in each group. Tex, the man in one group, and Clem, the man in the other group. So this extensive testimony, and if you're listening, I'm sure you're saying, hey, talked about all this in part 2. Well, we kind of wanted to do it as a review, and we wanted you to see the detail with which she recounted the crimes. And it's this level of detail that allows the police to obtain arrest warrants for the rest of the family members. And they do, in fact, do that. Police arrest Krenwinkel near her aunt's home in Mobile, Alabama. Tex Watson had gone back to Texas after the murders, and he was arrested there. He actually fought extradition, so Manson and the other family members went on trial without him. Mary Bruner and Sandra Good were not involved in the murders because they had been arrested on August 8 using stolen credit cards. Turned out to be probably the luckiest thing that could have happened to them.
Susan Atkins testified about all this detail of the crime before the grand jury. And they're going to get ready to go to trial. They have them arrested. But Susan Atkins talks to the family members and talks to Manson and decides, I'm going to recant my grand jury testimony. And I'm going to testify at trial to something different. So the original star witness was Susan Atkins. But then they get Linda Kasabian. And Kasabian wound up being an excellent witness for this case. I mean, they said they could have not chosen anybody better or more strong to put on that stand, and we will get into that in a moment. The trial begins, and the original prosecutor was Aaron Stovitz, but he was removed after commenting on the case directly to the media. He was replaced by 35-year-old Vincent Bugliosi. July 15th of 1970, the trial begins. And they are prosecuting 36-year-old Manson, 21-year-old Susan Atkins, 22-year-old Patricia Krenwinkel, and 20-year-old Leslie Van Houten on murder charges. There were 12 jurors and 5 alternates who were sequestered and put up at the Ambassador Hotel, which was costing $1,500 a day to house and feed. Irving Canarak was Manson's defense attorney. Paul Fitzgerald represented Atkins. This jury was comprised of 7 men and 5 women who were mostly over the age of 40. One was a 74-year-old retired sheriff's deputy. 2 were secretaries. 1 was a retired newspaper drama critic, a social worker, 2 electricians, and 1 undertaker. In August, shortly after that trial began in July, President Nixon makes the statement that Manson was guilty, either directly or indirectly, and this was all over the national news. So when it comes to court, Manson holds up that newspaper that read, "Nixon says Manson is guilty," and his attorney asked for a mistrial, but that was denied. A few months into the trial, Thanksgiving comes along. The judge gave them a week-long break to prepare for closing statements and to give everybody time off for Thanksgiving. And Ronald Hughes decided to take his Thanksgiving break and go camping. Hughes was one of the original defense attorneys for Manson, but by now he was just representing Leslie Van Houten. He had recused himself from Manson's defense because he felt it was not in the best interest of Van Houten to also be part of Manson's defense. Now, this decision might have cost him his life. When court resumed after the Thanksgiving break, Hughes didn't return. His body was found several months later. There's no solid evidence that it was a retaliation murder committed by the Manson family, but there's really not concrete evidence to say that he died in an accident either. It was theorized that he died in slides during the heavy rains that weekend. So the judge appoints Maxwell Keith as Van Houten's new attorney. And Van Houten objected to her new court-appointed attorney, and she refused to accept Keith as her new attorney and requested Mary Fielder. The judge said he was not going to delay the trial any longer, and Van Houten objected to that and refused to take her seat. She ended up in a shoving match with the bailiffs, so Atkins and Krenwinkel join into the shoving match, and Van Houten ends up slapping one of the bailiffs. The 3 women were removed from the courtroom, and then Manson was removed when he began shouting at the judge. They had a recess, and then the 4 defendants were returned to the courtroom, but the 3 women had to be removed again. So the prosecution presents their case. And they say although Manson didn't wield the weapons that committed the murders, he had complete control over these young people in his cult. And the family members didn't actually have the motive for murder. But Manson and his helter-skelter revelations were the motives for the murder. The law of conspiracy is what made Manson guilty of all 7 murders. The prosecution said that helter-skelter is that primary motive, and igniting this apocalyptic race war is what Manson was trying to do. They said Manson was also motivated by his extreme hatred of the establishment. They said the Tate Polanski home was selected because Terry Melcher had lived there previously and Melcher had rejected Manson. Manson had also been escorted off of that property once Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski moved in. A witness from the murders on Cielo Drive said they heard gunshots somewhere around midnight. But the star witness, Linda Kasabian, gave most of the details. Kasabian gives those details that we told earlier when we were talking about the Tate crimes. And, Manson told them, leave a sign, and you girls know what I mean, do something witchy. She gives some of those same details that Susan Atkins originally gave in her grand jury testimony, but Kasabian was not inside the home, so she didn't see what took place. Atkins had said Tex had done all the stabbings, but Kasabian actually saw Krenwinkel chasing after Abigail Folger and stabbing her. She testified that when they returned to the ranch, Manson directed Krenwinkel and Kasabian to go through the car and to make sure to wipe off any blood spots. And Manson was upset with the group because he said they had been sloppy. The next day after dinner, when Manson told them to go get that change of clothes, she knew exactly what was going to happen. On September 1st of 1969, a 10-year-old boy becomes a witness for this case. His name was Stephen Weiss. On that date, he had found a gun on the hillside in his backyard a month after the murders. He told his father about the gun, and they called the police. And this gun's put into police evidence. The gun had a broken handle, and it was later identified as the murder weapon at the Cielo Drive home. But initially, it just sat in evidence until Weiss's father saw on the news where they were looking for the murder weapon. So he calls the police and says, "Hey, y'all are looking for this specific gun, and I turned a gun into y'all back in September, and it might be what y'all were looking for." And it in fact was. Manson's attorney questioned the coroner about Abigail Folger and her injuries. And he was trying to prove that Kasabian, the prosecution star witness who was given immunity, could have saved Abigail's life. He asked the coroner if she would have died from each individual stab wound, or if someone had intervened before she was stabbed again and received immediate medical attention, if she would have lived. The defense attorneys presented no witnesses of their own or any evidence. Now, all through the trial, these three women were still loyal to Manson. Susan Atkins, after telling Virginia Graham her story in jail and testifying before the grand jury, says in court that it was her that killed Sharon Tate, and it was not Manson who came up with the plan, but it was the idea of Linda Kasabian, the prosecution's witness. She said the motive of these murders was to draw suspicion away from the murder of Gary Hinman, and it wasn't anything to do with trying to start a race war. She said Bobby Beausoleil had been arrested for the murder of Hinman, but it was her that had committed the Hinman murder. She said the murders they committed after Gary Hinman were just to draw suspicion away from Bobby and to set Bobby free. After the murder of Gary Hinman, Atkins said she, Van Houten, and Krenwinkel were talking about what they could do to help Bobby out, and Kasabian overheard them. Kasabian's the one that told him to make it look like somebody else did it and do a copycat murder. Atkins said Kasabian told them to make more of the same kind of murders, lots of them, everywhere, and then they would cut Bobby loose and everybody would go free. Atkins said on the night of the murders at the Tate home, Kasabian is the one that led them to the Tate home. She said Kasabian had been burned trying to buy drugs at the Tate residence and picked that house in order to get revenge on them. But when it comes to Atkins testifying about the details of the murder, that wasn't as clear to her. Atkins said she was stoned on acid and could only remember a few of the details of the actual crime. She said she knows the victims kept asking them not to hurt them and said that they wouldn't tell the police. Atkins said Frykowski kept pulling her hair and she was in a fight for her life. So she just started swinging her knife and she felt it sink into something but didn't know what it was. Krenwinkel said she was fighting with two women when Linda Kasabian came to help her. Atkins says Folger and Frykowski ran out of the house and she was alone with Tate. She testified that Manson didn't even go to the LaBianca home. But Kasabian had testified Manson entered the home first and sent three of the family members back inside to complete the murders, which went along with Susan Atkins' grand jury testimony. In the prosecution's closing arguments, he stressed the complete and absolute control Manson had over the members of his family. So much so, he even regulated their sexual activities. He said that just a few hours before the Tate murders, Manson had said it was time for helter skelter. He said that Manson and his family were not hippies. They looked like hippies and used some hippie talk about free love, but Manson felt that hippies were weak, so they were not hippies, and he talked about how Manson came up with the term slippies. Paul Fitzgerald was a 33-year-old former prize fighter, and he was put on the defense team and gave closing arguments. He pointed out that the prosecutor, Bugliosi, during his closing arguments, used the word murder 254 times, blood and bloody 36 times, kill and killers 49 times, vicious, cold-blooded, and savage 53 times, death and death penalty 67 times. Fitzgerald also described in great detail how death takes place in a gas chamber, taking 8 minutes before the person is dead. The trial of Manson and his family lasted around 10 months and was the most expensive trial to date when it ended in 1971, costing more than $500,000.
So Jen's already mentioned some of the courtroom antics that went on, fighting with bailiffs and that kind of thing, but there was plenty of other courtroom drama during the trial. Manson released his album Lie in order to raise money for his defense, and Manson seemed to love the media attention, and that probably led to some of his antics and kind of built up. He acted crazy for the camera. He definitely played to the camera. On October 13th, 1970, he and Atkins were brought into court to enter pleas on the Hinman murder, but they both stood up and turned their backs to the judge. So the court entered not guilty pleas for both of them. Again, just a show. He could have said not guilty, or he could have pled guilty. At one point, he carved an X onto his forehead because he said he was X'd out of society, and he shaved his head as this rebellion thing. He's been X'd out of society and he shaved his head. And we all know that years after the trial, this X on Manson's forehead, he converted to a swastika. But it originally started out as an X. And Atkins, Van Houten, and Krenwinkel followed suit, and they carved X's into their foreheads also, as well as shaved their heads. Many of the family members who weren't on trial emulated this as well, carved their X's and shaved their head. There was so much drama and theatrics going on, the Manson family members who weren't on trial had to be banned from the courtroom. Manson would often create outbursts, and the girls would chant and sing during the trial. And at one point, Manson interrupted testimony by saying, "This lawyer is not doing what I asked him to do. He is not my attorney." The judge told Manson that he couldn't address the court and that he would have to speak through his attorney. And Manson replied, "He's not my attorney." The judge reminded Manson that he had told him in the past that he was not to speak out during court, but Manson said, "I would like to dismiss this man." The judge called a recess and got the jury out of the room. Manson then began to argue that he should be allowed to represent himself because he had no rapport with his attorneys. He said, "I've asked Mr. Canarek not to do certain things and he does them. I've asked him not to ask certain questions and he asks them anyway. I like him very much as a person, but as an attorney, he doesn't represent me. He can't represent me." The judge denied Manson's request, telling him that he was not competent enough to represent himself in a case this complex. Manson replied with, "I'm very capable of handling it myself. I think a lot of people realize it. I think that's the reason I'm not allowed to." But the biggest performance was on October 5th of 1970. Manson said, "The moment I see you are going to kill me, do you know what I'm going to do?" And the judge stopped and said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have you removed, Mr. Manson, if you don't stop." Manson then yelled, "I'm going to have you removed if you don't stop. I have a little system of my own," Manson said, and then jumped from the defense table and lunged at the judge. Manson said over and over again that he didn't understand why he was called a murderer. He never murdered anyone. He didn't need to kill anyone. He just thinks it. And I guess he just means he thinks he's killing someone. Manson's testimony was strange all the time.
Actually, his testimony was given with the jury out because there was a debate as if he was going to testify. So they take the jury out and let him testify. And after he does that, he decides that he doesn't want to testify in front of the jury.
At one point, Manson says, "You people think with your mind, but that's not how I do it. I've spent my life locked up. I've stayed a child while you have grown up. I don't judge anyone. I judge only myself, and I'm content with myself. You want to put me in a penitentiary, but that's nothing. You kicked me out of the last one. I didn't want to go. I liked it there. And then children come at you with knives. You told them what to do. I didn't tell them. They're the children you didn't want, and I took them on my garbage dump." For all this words and strange behavior and this convoluted defense and everybody blaming everybody, at the end of the day, all of them are sentenced to death. But, as our fans may or may not be aware, in 1972, all death sentences in California are commuted to life sentences. And so, although they were convicted and sentenced to die, they were saved by this commutation because California got rid of the death penalty. It's worth noting that California, although they don't do it very often, has reinstated the death penalty, but that doesn't mean your death sentence gets reinstated. Once you're commuted to life, it stays life.
So some things that happen after the trial. Some of the police and others involved in the prosecution say, the prosecution presented this motive of helter-skelter, but we don't feel that race war was the real motive. We think the motive of trying to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail was the motive. Or we think his anger with the establishment was the motive. So there was some argument as to what Manson's real motive was. What did the Beatles think of Manson? Well, they hated him. They said their songs were about peace and love, and Manson tried to ruin that. They said Helter Skelter literally meant chaos and not anything like Manson portrayed. Later, Manson denied he had an obsession with the Beatles and said he was more of a Bing Crosby fan.
He strikes me as a Bing Crosby fan. So one of the things that I find most interesting about these cases is what happens to the places where they occur. In a lot of crimes, you can actually go to the place where it happened. I mean, it has kind of an eerie connotation and feel to it. But me personally, I've always been intrigued by what happened to the places where these things happened. And we're going to tell you about a few of those. Spahn Ranch, which was the home of the Manson family, as we spoke about, the primary home, it actually burned in 1970 from wildfires, so it didn't make it long. It was gone by the time the trial happened. George Spahn died in 1974, and the Barker Ranch, another area frequented by the Manson family, located in Inyo County, is now part of the Death Valley National Park. So we talked about what happened to the ranch and the homes where the Manson family were, but as most of our fans know, Jen does all the research for these cases. And I just happened to be sitting around. I kind of thought to myself, because like I said, I'm always interested in the places where it happened. What happened to the Tate and LaBianca homes? And she said, "Well, why don't you research it and find out?" So I did. And I kind of took a deep dive into 10050 Cielo Drive, and I learned a bunch of interesting stuff about it. The home was a French Normandy-style home built in 1941 by J.F. Watkins, and it was actually designed by famous home designer Robert Byrd. The home was originally built for a French actress named Michelle Morgan, and she paid, in 1941, $32,000 for the home. The home was sold in 1945 to Hartley Dewey, who leased the home to high-profile tenants, and one of those high-profile tenants was Lillian Gish, and that may not mean anything to most people, but she was a silent film star of the time and very, very popular. Miss Gish moved out in 1946, and the ownership records and who were tenants there and who owned it got kind of sketchy from 1946 to 1960, but everything starts to pick back up in 1963 when the home was purchased by Rudolph Altobelli for $86,000. Now, for perspective, $86,000 in 1963 is roughly $700,000 in today's money. Now, Mr. Altobelli was an agent for Hollywood stars, and he represented some very famous people. In fact, he was the agent for Katharine Hepburn and Henry Fonda. He lived in the home for a short time and then began renting it out. And it was rented out to these up-and-coming Hollywood stars. It was reported that Cary Grant spent a portion of his honeymoon there. And we start to get closer to Manson's time in the story in 1966. Altobelli rented the home to Terry Melcher, who we didn't mention before, but this is also an interesting fact about him. That is Doris Day's son. Terry Melcher was Doris Day's son. And renting the home to Melcher is obviously what set the crimes in motion. Melcher lived at the home with his girlfriend, another name you might recognize, Candace Bergen of Murphy Brown fame, another famous actress. And the home was frequently visited by Manson when Bergen and Melcher lived there. It was not unusual to see Manson at the home, hanging out, eating food in the kitchen. I mean, he was a regular hang-around, I guess, at the home on Cielo Drive, so he was very familiar with it. Melcher and Bergen moved to a beach house in Malibu, kind of on a whim, and that's what led to the home on Cielo Drive being rented to Polanski and Tate. And for a long time, it was believed that Melcher and Bergen were the targets of the August 9th murders, but in fact they weren't. As Jen mentioned, Manson was aware of the fact that Melcher and Bergen no longer resided there. In fact, he knew they had moved to the beach house in Malibu. After the murders, things take a strange and frankly sad turn. Altobelli sued Roman Polanski, who, if you'll remember, was Sharon Tate's husband, who was out of town during the killings. But Altobelli, the owner of the home, sued Polanski and Time magazine because Polanski commissioned them to do a photo shoot at the residence. And Altobelli claimed that this photo shoot destroyed the resale value of the home. And one of the pictures that was taken was a very poignant picture of Polanski knelt down by the front door where Pig is written in blood. And as if we already didn't like Mr. Altobelli for giving Polanski a hard time about this photo shoot, he also sued Sharon Tate's family for $480,000. And this happened after he sent the Tate family a bill for damage done to the home during the murder. Yes, you heard that correctly. He sent a bill to Sharon Tate's parents to fix things that were damaged in the home during the murder. And of course, this drew a very sarcastic response to Tate's father and prompted the lawsuit. He asked for $480,000, and Altobelli was actually awarded $4,350 to repair his property. 3 weeks after the murders, Altobelli himself moved back into the home. He was unable to rent it out because of the stigma from the murders. I mean, I can understand that. I would be very reluctant to be the next tenant living there. But Altobelli remained in the home until selling it in 1988. The last tenant was a name that might be familiar to everybody, Trent Reznor. And if it's not, Trent Reznor was the frontman for Nine Inch Nails, the band Nine Inch Nails, one of my favorites. And he claimed to have no idea of the history of the house until he signed a lease agreement. And the lease agreement had a mandatory disclosure clause that told him, hey, this is the Tate home from the Manson murders. He claims he didn't know that. I find that very difficult to believe. Reznor paid $11,000 a month in rent, and he built a studio that he named Pig inside the home. The 1994 hit album Downward Spiral was recorded there, and Reznor denied allegations that the home inspired the Downward Spiral album, even though it has several songs titled March of the Pigs and Piggy. Reznor continued to recant, and he later stated that he regretted renting the home at all. Reznor took one final step. Knowing that the home was slated for destruction, Reznor removed the infamous front door. And it was the same door that was in place at the time of the murders. So the actual front door that had had Pig written in Sharon Tate's blood on it, Reznor removes the door and used it as the front door for his New Orleans recording label Nothing Studios, which was a converted funeral home. The door has since been removed from that building in New Orleans. The home was finally destroyed in 1994, and it has been replaced by an 18,000 square foot Mediterranean mansion, and the address has been changed to 10066 Cielo Drive to hopefully throw off onlookers. The original property owner, that French actress Michelle Morgan, she died in 2016, and although there's no indication that she ever returned to her home that she had custom built for her, she would have likely found the property unrecognizable. I found out a whole lot less about the LaBianca home that was located at 3001 Waverly Drive, but it is still standing, and it is in the exact same configuration as it was during the murders. In fact, it hasn't even really been updated a lot since then, certain areas of the home. The home was built in the 1920s and is only 1,700 square feet. Now, to put that in perspective, the guest house at the Tate home was 2,000 square feet. So the LaBianca's home was smaller than the guest home on the Tate property. The address has been changed to 3011 Waverly Drive. And again, that's to kind of throw off the, onlookers or whatever. People like me who would like to go to a place where this crime happened, I guess. And the home was at one point purchased by Zach Baggins of Ghost Hunter fame. He purchased it in 2019 and had planned to do some kind of paranormal activity show there. And he decided not to do that out of respect for the LaBianca family. It was last sold in 2021 for $1.9 million, which isn't much in the Los Angeles area, and was purchased by an undisclosed buyer who wants to remain anonymous because of the home's history, but it is said to be in need of major updates and renovations.
Some of the players in this case, what happened to them? Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor, he was 35 when he was assigned to the Manson trial. He called 84 witnesses and presented 290 pieces of evidence. Bugliosi became the author of a best-selling novel titled Helter Skelter. It sold more than 7 million copies. It became a New York Times bestseller and is still one of the best-selling true crime books of all time. Mr. Bugliosi died in 2015 after a year-long battle with cancer. Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate's husband at the time of the murder. Now, Roman was known for directing movies such as Rosemary's Baby. He was born in Paris in 1933, but his parents were native to Poland. He made several films before moving to the U.S. in 1968 after he married Sharon Tate. But in 1978, Roman Polanski fled the U.S. for Paris to escape charges for sex with a 13-year-old girl. To this date, Polanski is still a fugitive and wanted by the U.S. In 2016, this victim, who was 13 at the time of the crime, asked the judge to sentence him to time served to stop the media spectacle. Polanski was expelled from the Academy of Motion Pictures, and he is currently 88 years old. Then we have Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys' Dennis Wilson, and we could do an episode just on Dennis Wilson alone. So Wilson had been in this downward spiral for years, even before Manson. By 1978, he was struggling with alcoholism and heroin use. In 1979, he was kicked out of the Beach Boys, but he got stuff in order enough to rejoin in 1980. By the end of 1983, he had been married 5 times and was going through another divorce. Dennis had 4 children, Jennifer, Carl, Michael, and Gage. But on Christmas Day of 1983 around midnight, Wilson was beaten up by a male friend of his estranged wife, Sean Love Wilson. They had just married in July of that year and had a 1-year-old child. Now, Sean Love Wilson was the 19-year-old daughter of Wilson's cousin and bandmate, Mike Love. Wilson had checked himself out of a detox unit on that Christmas day before he was assaulted. So after he's assaulted, his friends bring him back to the hospital to be admitted to detox, but they wouldn't take him back. So Wilson continued drinking heavily and using drugs. So 3 days later, on December 28th, 1983, Wilson was hanging out on the boat of a friend and decided to go diving in 58-degree temperature murky water at Marina del Rey. He had been drinking all day and all night and had very little sleep. He had done several dives around noon for about 20 minutes and he quit because he had gotten so cold and needed to warm up. Around 4 p.m., he wanted to dive back down in the water to look for more things. And all he was really pulling up was junk. I mean, it was right there in the marina. So he does a few more dives until he finally went under the water and didn't come back up. His friends on that boat were watching him dive, and he didn't come up, so they flagged down Harbor Patrol. It took Harbor Patrol about 30 minutes to find his body and pull him from the water. Dennis Wilson was dead at the age of 39. His blood alcohol level was a .26. So, in perspective, that's 3 times the legal limit for driving.
So what happened to the family members? Some who were involved in the Tate LaBianca murders and some who weren't. Well, Steve Grogan, Clem as he was known by the other family members, was convicted of the murder of Donald Shorty Shea, although they never recovered Shea's body. Prosecutors used the testimony of another former family member, Barbara Hoyt, to convict Manson, Clem, and Bruce Davis. He is the only family member involved in the murders that has ever been paroled. He was released in 1985 because he led authorities to Shea's body, which had not been found, and he told them where they could find it. He has since married and has 2 sons. Lynette Squeaky Frome was probably the most diehard Manson girl, and she is still a huge Manson follower to this day, which is unusual because none of the other ones are. She was arrested during the trial for conspiring to poison a witness from the prosecution with LSD. And as I said, most of the family began to denounce their ties with Manson and Manson himself after the conviction, but not her. She and Sandra Good actually moved to Sacramento to be closer to Manson once he was moved to Folsom Prison. She and Good actually got deeper into his philosophical teachings, and Frome changed her name to Red, and Good changed her name to Blue. They would often wear robes that were the color of their names. Now, Squeaky was not directly involved in the murders, but she ended up getting to go to prison too, because in 1975 she was convicted of trying to kill President Gerald Ford while he was visiting Sacramento, California. Luckily, she did not get a shot off before the Secret Service was able to take her to the ground, and many reports say that the gun that she had was not actually loaded. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison for the attempted assassination of a U.S. president. She was in federal prison, and in 1987 she escaped from prison in West Virginia, but was captured 2 days later and only about 2 miles from the prison. She has stayed in touch with Manson. She did so while in prison, and in August of 2009 she was released at the age of 60 after having served 34 years. She then moved to New York with her boyfriend. She has still not denounced Manson. Linda Kasabian, the star witness for the prosecution, now she was granted immunity. Jen mentioned that. And the prosecution said that Kasabian didn't ask for immunity, that she was always willing to testify, but they did give her that immunity. And she was said to have done outstanding as a witness during her 18 days of testimony. She said she did not report Manson and the family on her own because she feared for her safety and her daughter's safety. After testifying against the family, she went back to her family in New Hampshire and hid because she was obviously infamous at this time. She went on to have more children, but has struggled with drug addiction, alcohol, and other self-destructive behaviors. She has granted several interviews regarding her time as a Manson family member and the Tate LaBianca killings, but has always done so in disguise.
Bobby Beausoleil. he was convicted in 1970 for Gary Hinman's murder. In prison, he joined the Aryan Brotherhood and he got into several fights. In 1994, he was transferred to a prison in Oregon. He has had no disciplinary action since 2008. He has been denied parole at least 18 times, and his next hearing is set for July of 2023. Bruce Davis, who was convicted in 1972 for his part in the murder of Gary Hinman and Donald Shea, but he did not participate in the Tate or the LaBianca murders, he became a born-again Christian and earned a doctoral degree in philosophy of religion, and he ministers to other inmates. He was married while in prison and has a child. Davis has been denied parole 30 times. In 2017, the board actually did recommend he be released, but the governor denied it. Mary Brenner, who had the son Valentine with Manson, her son eventually went to live with her parents in Wisconsin, and they got custody. Valentine said he did not know the identity of his father until he was in 3rd grade, and he thought Mary was his older sister. He said he had no desire to ever meet or speak with Charles Manson. So Mary, this matriarch of the family, who did not like to share Manson, wound up receiving immunity in turn for her testimony against the family. But later she became part of a plot to hijack a plane to free Manson in 1971. But they didn't get so far as hijacking the plane because they were caught stealing guns from a sporting goods store, and she spent 6 years in prison for this. She was released in 1977 and moved to the Midwest and changed her name.
Sandra Good, known as Sandy, was known as smart but needy. She remained a Manson follower for a long time. In 1975, she and Susan Murphy were arrested for sending nearly 200 hostile and threatening letters to corporate executives. In these letters, they threatened the corporate executives and government officials if they didn't stop destroying the environment, they would kill them. They threatened them with death. She represented herself in court, where she was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years. She served 10. She was released in 1985, and then when her parole ended, she moved to California in an effort to be closer to Manson, but was denied visiting privileges. Patricia Krenwinkel goes by the nickname Krenny in prison. She has done interviews from prison. She said that she feels like a coward for allowing herself to lose her identity to Manson. She was 19 when she joined the family, and she was trying to figure out who she was supposed to be. She said she just wanted to feel safe. As the family grew, Krenwinkel began to view herself as just one of many. Manson immediately gave her a name, Katie. There was no more Patricia Krenwinkel. She had no money of her own. And she said that Manson did these weird things that led to an increase in his influence over them. They became physically and psychologically dependent on him. She said that Manson played with knives and would have her stand up and he would throw them at her. He told her if she tried to leave, she would be killed. He told her that she would do whatever he said because she knew that she needed him, and she did believe that. He also told her to give him sex when he chose and how he chose, or she would have to stay outside all night in the cold. He made her stand up in the middle of the group of the family while she was completely naked. They would discuss her faults and call her ugly and stupid, telling her that nobody wanted her and she was worth nothing. Manson would tell her that he was the one who was going to make her worth something. During the trial, she accepted that she was nothing and that Manson was everything, and that is why she shaved her head in solidarity with Manson. While in prison, she was told by other people who were associates of the family that Manson had sold her in a card game, and she was now to follow another person, and she was to escape from prison because Manson said so. This was the first time she said no. She said she could not believe she was worth nothing more than being sold in a card game. She now had to face that everything she knew and had lived for up to this point was wrong, and that she was responsible for her own actions. Krenwinkel had actively participated in the murders at both locations. She was 21 at the time of the crimes, and she says today that she feels terrible, and no matter what she does, she can't change what she did. She's earned a bachelor's degree in human services and is involved with various prison programs. She has been denied parole numerous times. She was denied for the 14th time in June of 2017 at the age of 69, and her next hearing is set for June of 2022. She said that some days she still doesn't like the person that she is. She is currently the longest serving female inmate in California at around 52 years. She mentors others in prison and has never received any disciplinary actions. Leslie Van Houten showed very little remorse while in court. She later recalled stabbing Rosemary LaBianca in the abdomen 14 to 16 times. She wiped away fingerprints and burned the clothes that she had been wearing. She took chocolate milk and cheese from the LaBianca refrigerator after the murders and ate them while she was there. She later said that she regretted the crimes, and at the time she was mentally ill, and that was aggravated by the use of LSD. She said that at the time she believed Manson was Jesus Christ. She has been disciplinary free her entire time in prison. She earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree while in prison and leads a self-help group for fellow inmates. In a parole hearing 30 years after the crime, she said she was horrified at what she had done. She was granted parole in November of 2021 after having been denied 21 previous times, but as with the other members who the parole board actually recommended parole, the governor of California denied the parole.
Susan Atkins, who was said to be the scariest of the women of the Manson followers, at her sentencing, she told the court, "You better lock your doors and watch your own kids." Now, she had given birth to a child a year before. She gave that child up for adoption when she went to prison. While in prison in 1974, she became a born-again Christian and apologized for her crimes. She wrote a memoir entitled Child of Satan, Child of God with Bob Schlosser. She denounced Manson, formed a prison ministry, and did charitable work. She married twice while in prison. In 1981, she had married Donald LaSure, who was a self-proclaimed Texas millionaire and had been married 35 times before Atkins. In 1987, she married James Whitehouse, the attorney who represented her in her last few parole hearings. She was denied parole 13 times. In 2005, the prison staff even advocated for her release. In 2008, she was diagnosed with brain cancer and filed for a compassionate release, but was denied. In 2009, at the age of 61, she died from brain cancer while serving her sentence in the women's prison at Chowchilla, still married to James Whitehouse. Tex Watson. Now, Tex fought his extradition, so his trial didn't take place with Manson and the three girls. Once he was extradited back to California, he pled guilty by reason of insanity from overuse of hallucinogenic drugs. But he was deemed fit for trial and convicted of murder. He was given death, but, like the others in 1972, was commuted. While in prison in San Diego County, he became an ordained minister. Also while in prison, he married and divorced and fathered 4 children. He has had no disciplinary actions since 1973. He wrote an autobiography titled Will You Die for Me? He earned a bachelor's degree in business management in 2009 and founded a prison ministry. He has been denied parole every time, with the last being October of 2021, and his next parole hearing is set for October of 2026. He still sits in Mule Creek Prison. Although several members were able to father children through conjugal visits, in the 1990s, California got rid of the conjugal visits for inmates serving life sentences, and Sharon Tate's mother was one of the biggest advocates for eliminating these visits.
So what about the ringleader, Charlie Manson? Manson filed claims that he was harassed while he was in the county jail by the sheriff's department while he was on trial. He claimed that he was deprived of pens, paper, and was forced to walk up and down a corridor until exhausted. He said that he was continually ordered to strip searches and had to talk to prospective witnesses through a double screen. He claimed that he was denied privileges for giving cigarettes to some other inmates in exchange for a newspaper, and informants were placed in cells near him to report on his activities. During his time in prison after the murders, he received more mail than any other prisoner in the U.S. prison system. Manson was never diagnosed with any mental illness. During his trial, he refused to submit to a psychiatric evaluation. In later years, he did get examined by several psychiatrists and psychologists, but they disagreed on whether or not he actually had a mental illness or if he was faking it. In prison, Manson, who we know loved the spotlight, continued to do interviews. He told reporters that he had no need to feel guilty, that he hadn't done anything he was ashamed of. He said that living is what scared him, dying was the easy part. He commented in the documentary Charles Manson, The Final Words, that he appreciated his notoriety. He said that he was the most famous human being alive, the most famous human in the world, and he wasn't even dead yet. In 1984, a fellow inmate set Manson on fire, causing him to have permanent scarring. At some point, a fan, for lack of a better term, entered Manson's life named Afton Burton. And in 2013, she told Rolling Stone that they were going to get married. She just wasn't sure when. She was 19 when she moved from Illinois to Courtroom to be near Manson in prison. She ran numerous websites trying to get Manson released. In November 2014, 26-year-old Burton, who went by Star, and 80-year-old Manson got a marriage license. It was reported by Daniel Simone that Burton wanted to marry Manson in order to publicly display his body after his death and profit from it. Their marriage license expired in 2015 without them ever having gotten married. On November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, Charles Manson died. He had been diagnosed with colon cancer but died from cardiac arrest. He had been denied parole 12 times and had racked up hundreds of rule violations while in prison. Prior to his life in prison, Manson had had a few children, all sons. With his first wife, Rosalie Jean Willis, who left him when he went to prison in 1957, he had his child who was named Charles Manson Jr. Charles Manson Jr. changed his name to Jay White in order to get away from the notoriety of his father, but he committed suicide in 1993. In 1959, Manson briefly married a prostitute, Leona Ray Stevens, known as Candy, and they had a second son, Charles Luther Manson. Leona officially divorced Manson in 1963. He did not have any contact with his first two sons. These offspring become more important at the end of Manson's life. There was a court battle over his remains, and Manson's remains ended up going to Jason Friedman, the grandson of Manson. Jason was the child of Charles Manson Jr., Manson's oldest son, who I mentioned was Manson's oldest son with his wife, Rosalie.
And some additional information. February 1970, there was an infamous murder that took place on Fort Bragg in North Carolina, with the suspect being Captain Jeffrey McDonald, who killed his family. McDonald told police that 3 men and a blonde woman with a floppy hat had killed his family. He said one of the offenders was saying, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." McDonald's wife was pregnant at the time. Prosecutors of this case believe that McDonald killed his family, but blamed it on a group of hippies, and his story kind of got concocted from the story of what had happened with the Mansons, which was coming to trial at the time. Another bit of information, Rosemary LaBianca's granddaughter, Ariana Walk. Now, she was the daughter of Rosemary's daughter, Susan. Ariana was 40 when she was stabbed to death in her apartment in Denver, Colorado in July of 2020. 24-year-old Jose Sandoval Romero was arrested for the murder. He was an acquaintance of Ariana and confessed to the crime. So Susan lost her mother to a murder by stabbing and her daughter to a murder by stabbing.
It's incredible and very sad.
Normally we would do a discussion at this point, but I don't know what there really is to discuss. I mean, we've presented all this information and we kind of want to hear your thoughts. I mean, what are some of the things about this case that you think are unusual or you will have something to say about?
Yeah, we really want to hear your opinions on the case, and we hope that we've presented a fresh look at this story. I know that the Charles Manson case is very popular and has been covered extensively on all forms of media, but I think that Jen did a really good job researching this one, and I really enjoyed presenting this case with her. We hope you've enjoyed it. And as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.